Have you ever wished for immortality? That you could live on forever, maybe even play a role in helping future generations indefinitely. Or maybe eternal souls are already living among us. Maybe doctors, some genius engineer, a rogue mad scientist. What if immortality looked nothing like you thought it would look like? Well, let me introduce you to Henrietta Lacks, not a doctor or a scientist, but a young mother who died decades ago, whose eternal presence is still making science history. Henrietta Lacks was living in Baltimore with her husband and 5 children in 1951. She loved cooking, dancing, and her signature red nail polish. Those who knew her said, being with her was like being with fun. She was always taking care of others, and when she was diagnosed with cervical cancer at just 30 years old, she only told the people who absolutely needed to know because she didn't want anyone else to worry about her. In February of 1951, Henrietta began treatments for her cancer at Johns Hopkins University, and some of her cancer cells were sent to the lab of George Otto Guy, who was working on culturing immortal cell lines, which is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. Cells that can keep reproducing more cells indefinitely outside of the human body. These cell lines would have many advantages. They could make experiments reproducible, consistent, more cost-effective. So far, all of the human cells Guy had tried to grow had died out soon after collection. Which, as I'll talk about in a moment, makes sense. By nature, cells aren't meant to live forever, and they even have specific instructions in place that keep them from doing so. But these cells were different. They continue to grow and divide as long as they were given the right cell food. For my cells, that would clearly be tacos and donuts, but I'm told that's inappropriate lab protocol. They had to be kept cold just to keep them from overrunning the lab. Named HeLa for the first letters of Henrietta's first and last name, these cells seemed unstoppable. So let's talk about cell biology. Cells replicate their genetic material and then divide into new cells. Since we're not all amorphous blobs... Stop. My fingers are very well differentiated. Thank you for noticing. You've probably guessed that an important part of a cell's life cycle is knowing when to stop dividing, or even when to die off, known as apoptosis or programmed cell death. Cells typically only divide up to about 50 times before getting the built-in signal to stop, also known as reaching cell senescence. Often this is due to the shortening of telomeres, repeating codes of DNA that protect the ends of chromosomes, like tails. These tails get shorter each time the cell reproduces, and when the tails get too short, the cell gets word that its glory days are over, but it can still sit on the bench and support the team. Both senescence and apoptosis can also be induced by damage to the cell, to prevent the damaged cells from reproducing and causing harm to the organism. So next time you get a sunburn, remember that the pain is just your cells screaming in horror at what you've made them do. So what's the deal with HeLa cells? How are they giving the cytoplasmic finger to these rules? While some suggest that evil spirits may be involved, the short answer is that HeLa cells are cancer cells, which by their very nature divide unchecked. Guy tried to grow non-cancerous cells of Henrietta's, and just like the others before HeLa, they died out within days. Specifically, HeLa cells express the enzyme telomerase, which adds length onto those telomere tails we talked about, so that they're never short enough in subsequent generations to trigger senescence. Most adult cells don't express telomerase, but tumor cells often do. Additionally, HeLa cells are infected by human papillomavirus, HPV, which has caused alterations to switch off the cell's methods of regulating its growth. Because viruses are assholes. Back in 1951, Guy began to distribute the HeLa cells to any researcher that wished to use them, and soon, researchers all over the country and the world were using HeLa. To date, many trillions of HeLa cells have been reproduced for use in research. They've been critical to developing the vaccine for polio, mapping the human genome, advancing cell imaging and culturing techniques, researching cancer, blood disorders, HIV, countless other viruses. They've powered a flying car. Okay, well, I got a little carried away with that last one, but they were sent into space to be studied. That was particularly bizarre because HeLa multiplied even faster in space. Maybe there is something supernatural going on here. Some scientists have even suggested that HeLa should be considered its own species by now. It's safe to say that Henrietta Lacks has made an unprecedented contribution to science and medicine. Unfortunately, she never knew the impact her cells made. On October 4th, 1951, Henrietta succumbed to her unstoppable cancer cells. We tend to think immortality is something to strive for, but in cells, immortality can be harmful to the organism they make up. As is often the case with progress, this success story for all humankind came at a very real, human expense to Henrietta and her family. In fact, controversy over the HeLa line, how it was obtained, how it affected the Lacks family, remains today and has influenced modern laws about informed consent. While we can't thank her in person for her world-changing, albeit unwitting, contribution to science, we can acknowledge the impact Henrietta Lacks has made on our lives. If your parents and grandparents didn't have to live in an iron lung after an infection with the polio virus, thank Henrietta Lacks. If you have great doctors who know more about human disease than ever before, thank Henrietta Lacks. In a certain twist of poetic justice, HeLa cells were instrumental in developing a vaccine for HPV, potentially saving millions of people from cancers like the one that took Henrietta's life. And for that, you can thank the immortal Henrietta Lacks. Thank you for joining me today. To learn more about Henrietta Lacks and HeLa cells, I highly recommend the book The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks by Rebecca Skloot. Or, to go even further down the internet rabbit hole on anything we talked about today, check out the links below.